Hello and welcome to Podcast.init, the podcast about Python and the people who make it great. I would like to thank everyone who has donated to the show. Your contributions help us make the show sustainable. Linode is sponsoring us this week. Check them out at linode.com/podcastinit and get a $20 credit to try out their fast and reliable Linux virtual servers for your next project. We are also sponsored by Sentry this week. Stop hoping your users will report bugs. Sentry's real-time tracking gives you insight into production deployments and information to reproduce and fix crashes. Check them out at getsentry.com and use the code podcastinit at sign-up to get a $50 credit toward your account. You can also visit our site to subscribe to our show, sign up for our newsletter, read the show notes, and get in touch. And to help other people find the show, you can leave a review on iTunes and tell your friends and coworkers. You can also join our community forum at discourse.pythonpodcast.com for your opportunity to find out about upcoming guests, suggest questions, propose show ideas, and follow up with past guests. Your hosts as usual are Tobias Macy and Chris Patty. Today we're interviewing Michael Kennedy about his work with Talk Python to Me, another podcast about Python and its community, as well as his on-demand Python trainings. Michael has also offered to give away one of each of his Python courses to our listeners. If you'd like the chance to win, then sign up for our newsletter at pythonpodcast.com or our forum at discourse.pythonpodcast.com. If you want to double your chances to win, then sign up for both. Michael, could you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, hey guys. Thanks so much for having me on the show. As you said, my name's Michael, and probably most well-known among this community for my work at Talk Python to Me, the podcast, and some of the conference stuff that I've done around that. I've been a software developer for, it kind of bothers me to say this, but for going on like 20 years, and worked with a wide variety of technologies, probably mostly around the web and sort of NoSQL stuff like that.
Wait till it gets to be 25, it's even more shocking. It's like, I've been doing this for a quarter of a century.
Yeah, that's true. It's true. It's coming up quick as well. Think of it as wisdom, right? It's wisdom.
There you go. There you go. So, how did you get interested in Python?
The story about how I got into Python is a little bit interesting. I was working at a training company called Developmentor, and it was mostly sort of .NET and C++ focused with some web technologies thrown in there as well, JavaScript-y type things. And the Microsoft space was sort of stagnating a little bit, let's say. And personally, I had been doing that .NET type programming for quite a while, and I was ready to look around and sort of find something new and fresh, and really wanted to basically diversify. And so a couple of things came together, and they're like, why don't you research some other areas that we could go into and figure out, what's interesting and where we can add value, but also where there's demand. And I looked at a few places and I started playing with Python. And after about a week, I'm like, okay, I found my new thing. This is where I want to be, man. I just loved Python from the start. But, I wish I had gotten exposed to it earlier. That was about 4 years ago, I guess, that I was really dove into Python. And I've just been loving it since. So it's really great.
And what do you think it is about Python that makes people feel so strongly about it, both one way or the other?
It's, I think it's a couple of things. It's the technology, it's the ecosystem, and it's the community, right? You look at the programming language and it's just so clean, but not in a bad way, right? It doesn't give up its expressiveness or its power. And yet it doesn't have all the goo that goes into, something like, say, C++, where you've got, all the various ways to dereference pointers and just crazy syntax. You don't have that. But at the same time, you have this really powerful language. So I think people love working in the language. But then the ecosystem, there's just so much out there, right? Like 80,000 packages on PyPI. And then, we were recently at Pycon, right? The community I think it is really, really special. I think we'll talk about Pycon later, but compared to other tech communities, it's not the same. It is a special place. And I think those three things come together in sort of a reinforcing loop and just make people really like to be there. And that's certainly why I like to be there.
Yeah, I think another community that has somewhat similar parallels in terms of its inclusiveness is sort of the DevOps movement, where there is a very conscious effort to be cognizant of biases and inequalities and try to make everybody feel welcome. And Python definitely exemplifies that. And I think that they were one of the first communities to have such a strong focus on that as a general consensus.
Yeah, that's really cool.
So what is the craziest piece of software you've ever written?
Oh, man. So some of my first jobs out of college, or even in college, I kind of paid my way through some parts of grad school and stuff by doing programming and either working within the university on like research grants or working outside the university and then just, making more money than something else so I could pay for my tuition. And so I worked on a lot of these scientific visualization, computational things, worked on like Silicon Graphics supercomputers and doing like computational stuff there. So I got this job at this really cool company, which is still around, and they're doing great stuff in Southern California called eye tracking, like EYEtracking.com. And they used eye tracking, figuring out where you're looking in an environment, basically, to understand how people interact with all sorts of things. And so that's pretty cool. Like you can say, well, okay, you maybe are studying the way a website works, and you'd ask somebody like, if you're trying to understand the usability, you might say, hey, you want to return some item. Figure out how to do that, right? And you see if everybody looks to the top right and the return thing is in the bottom left, you put it in the top right, that kind of stuff. Well, that was all cool, but the group that I worked with was a bunch of cognitive science PhDs, and they found a way to study not where you're looking, but the diameter of your pupil. And they have this crazy algorithm using like wavelet decomposition and stuff that they came up with, that we coded, that will basically express how hard you are thinking. And so we literally built a gauge that I like internally called the thoughtometer. Like it literally would be like, the person is trying to solve a problem. Okay, they're done now. And it was the craziest thing ever. And we did a lot of weird collaborations with groups with the thoughtometer and some other stuff as well.
That is in equal parts amazingly cool and downright creepy.
Yes. It does not know what you're thinking. It only knows you are like mentally, it's like a CPU meter for the brain, basically.
Yeah, I've been listening to Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, and he talks about that as well, how they discovered that in their studies, the dilation of the pupil will have a direct correlation with how much mental effort somebody is expending on a given problem. So for anybody who wants a bit more of the background, you should take a look at that book.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. I've heard really good things about that book, but I haven't read it. But it is the same underlying principle, and we just came up with some math and computer software to give it a gauge.
So you've also taken some pretty drastic steps in your career, and particularly in reference to Python lately. So I'm wondering what inspired you to do that, and how's it going?
Oh, yeah. So in February, for a long time, I had been a full-time employee, right, at various companies, and enjoyed my time doing those things, but I've always kind of wanted to start my own company and do my own thing. When you're sitting in those meetings with 10 people talking about some entirely obscure, not going to make a difference in the world sort of thing, you're kind of thinking like, could I just go do something that matters, And so finally, I started the podcast back in March 2015, and it had been growing and growing, and that was starting to work out really well. And I was thinking about coming up with some of these online classes that I did. And so I ended up quitting my job and just sort of focusing only on the podcast and writing online courses. And I've been doing that since February. So that's been really going well. Terrifying, but going well.
That is truly impressive. I think it takes real courage and real confidence to be able to bet the farm basically on doing that. So congratulations. I'm glad that it's been successful so far, and I hope it continues to be.
Yeah, thanks so much. I mean, it's a half bet, right? It totally is a big deal, and like, because I have kids and I have a wife, and it's not like I'm 20 out of high school and I can live on ramen noodles, right? There's like stuff I have to support, right? Pay for. But on one half, the podcast was going well, and it provided a little bit of sort of foundation. But the betting part was really, could I create these online classes and would people care, right? And so that was super stressful, but it's going pretty well.
And going a bit into the online classes, what sort of platform are you using to be able to run those, both in terms of actually creating them and then also delivering them? Like, are you doing anything interesting with the presentation, or are they just video courses? I haven't actually done any of them myself yet. Yeah, sure. So there's a couple of things that are, I think, unusual about the way I'm doing it, and some that are like totally normal. So, I have all the recording gear, of course, from the podcast, right? And just using like Camtasia and screencasting and, a little bit of
other camera type stuff, right? Webcam type things to create them. And they're more or less video courses. I try to put a special spin on them so that I think they'll be more interesting. But in terms of delivery, like I ended up building my own website. I considered going with one of the places that you might think of for online courses, right? Like Udemy or Lynda or Pluralsight or some of these major subscription places. But in the end, I decided, look, I have this great community around the podcast. And if I really want to try to keep what I'm doing part of that community rather than just throwing it out there on the internet with a bunch of other people's stuff, it would make sense to sort of have more control over it and kind of keep it closer to the podcast. So I built a website and end up using Vimeo, like a white label pro version of Vimeo to deliver the videos. So that's pretty nice. And there's a lot of cool Python technology behind it, actually.
Yeah, and your decision to keep control over it rather than putting it into a larger pool of trainings, I'm sure, is also contributing to the success, because there's a lot of discussion, particularly in freelancing, about how in order to make yourself more marketable, you need to niche down and find what makes your offering unique rather than trying to go broad and appeal to everybody. Because by niching down, you have a smaller pool of people who you're marketing to, but those people are much more engaged and much more interested. So by leveraging the community of the podcast, you already have an engaged audience who's much more receptive to what you're trying to tell them with the trainings.
Yeah, I think, anyone who's listening and thinking about doing something like you said, freelancing or classes or whatever, that's absolutely, I think, the message to take away, that the broader you go, the harder it is to compete against everything out there. But if you become known for a thing, let's say asynchronous programming in Python or whatever, like if that's your thing and people they want to go learn about it, right? And they know that you're the person that always talks about this, it's very likely they'd be willing to go to you for that, right? So I think that's certainly a good lesson. And I think it also is what makes both of our podcasts successful. We stay pretty focused on what's relevant to the Python community. I know that we've both been approached by people from other sort of random areas, hey, I've got this other idea. It's sort of tangentially related to Python. And we're like, no, it's all about Python. And I think that's important.
I totally agree. I actually, even as a podcast listener, find it kind of annoying is too strong a word, because obviously I'm basically getting this content for free. So it's your bat and ball. If you want to go and do a completely different thing, it's totally up to you. But I find it a little frustrating when I start listening to a hardcore technical podcast and then they all of a sudden decide, hey, let's verge into, management and entrepreneurism. Not that those are bad things, those are good things, but I'm not interested in management and entrepreneur, and being an entrepreneur. So I kind of appreciate it when people are explicit with which niche they're going to inhabit. If you want to change the charter of your podcast and say, we're going to be tech and these other things too, well, then that's great. But if you say you're tech, be tech.
Yeah, I really feel like if you're, say, a blog or a podcast or something like this, if you try to be broad, you're just going to be lost in the world. You really have to be a thing. You have to have some reason that there's a group of people that come and check you out. Because if you want to just venture into, accounting and then entrepreneurship and then freelancing and then compilers and whatever, people, there's not a very good intersection of people that want those things. There's probably podcasts that focus on each one of those really well, right? So pick what matters and go with it, I think, is the message.
Given that you're pretty much self-taught as a developer, how did you get into the role of being a mentor and teaching other people how to program? And do you think that being self-taught is an advantage or a disadvantage in that space?
Oh, that last part, that's really good. So I went to college and I studied a lot of things. I kind of bounced around. I got my degree in math, and I was actually working on my PhD in math for a couple of years, 3 years. But along the way, I took some sort of minors in computer science and so on, because you had to have this certain number of credits to do it. And it was pretty interesting. But I never really felt like I learned much programming in college. Like, it wasn't until I sort of forced myself to go learn things on the side that really made a difference. And I think what really got me from sort of beginner to much farther down the line was after my first job working where this thought-o-meter was. This is my first sort of professional job outside the research grants and stuff. I would take like a half hour as part of my lunch every day, and I would get a book about something I didn't know in programming, and I would make sure every single day, not every day, most days, I would spend time and I would, maybe spend half an hour and just focus on that. Even though maybe I had some tight deadlines and I was done with lunch. I could have gone back and worked on my code, but I had an hour for lunch. So I took like a half hour, and I always, every day, just studied something for a half hour. And within a few years, I was starting to give presentations at code camps on things that I found really inspiring that I was learning and reading. And then some companies contacted me and said, hey, we'll pay you full time to do like training and presentations and learn all these things. And it just, every little bit just sort of piled up. And I think, it's not that I had some college degree that really made a great big difference in that regard. It's just that every little day you just deposit a bit towards your career, and pretty soon it piles up. So is it a positive or a negative? I think certainly there are negatives. Like if I wanted to go work at Google or Microsoft, they surely would have told me to take a hike or something. I would expect, right? But on the other hand, if you've got to start and teach yourself all these things, nothing seems that daunting, right? New things are like, well, there's just one more thing to go get, right? It's not like, I guess everything seems possible then.
And do you think that having that self-taught background has helped you in determining how to put together a training for other people?
I do. I think I feel like that the pain of learning is fresher because I had to sort of learn it after college. I remember not understanding why my C++ code won't link, and not understanding why all the little hangups that you forget, right? As you get more into the industry, you sort of, all the stuff that you used to stumble across, you kind of learn that so long ago that you forget. And I feel like because the pain is still a little fresh, I can empathize and know how to give some help around it maybe.
What inspired you to first get started with producing Talk Python to Me, and what did the ramp up look like?
Sure. So it's so funny, the timing around that, right? Like we both released our podcasts not knowing that each other existed within, I think, a week.
I think it was 3 days.
Yeah, 3 days. Gosh. And yeah, so that was back in March 2015 was when I first released my first episode. And I had been wanting to do a podcast for a long time. And I kind of felt like either the areas that I felt competent in talking about were too small, or there was already a bunch of really high quality stuff there. And I didn't feel like just trying to be like, oh, I'll just do this as well. And so I was really inspired around Python. And as I was starting to do more with it, I was like, I really want to find some podcasts because I love listening to podcasts. I want to find some podcasts about Python, hear the stories and sort of the background and the personalities behind it, not just the technology. And I looked around and I'm like, wait a minute, this can't be right. There's none. There used to be some, right? There were some really decent ones, but they all just, pod faded, right? They all went away. And so then I sort of thought about that for a while, and I thought, well, I really do want to create a podcast, and there are none for Python, and I'm super inspired about it. I don't really feel qualified to do it. Like I don't feel, there's so many experts out there that are at the time were so much more experienced in Python than I was, but I'm just like, you know what? If no one else is going to do it, I'll give it a shot. Hopefully some people come and listen. They don't make fun of me too much, Basically, that was how I started. So I got super inspired a weekend. I think it was like Friday night. And I just, started sketching out the ideas, working on the website, and just like blazed through it over the weekend. I think it was done Monday morning or something like that and ready to go. But yeah, that's the story.
Yeah, I can definitely agree with the feeling of not necessarily thinking that I am qualified to be hosting a podcast about Python, but the benefit is that as the host, you don't necessarily have to be expert at anything because that's what the guests are for. They're there to bring in their knowledge and their expertise about their particular subject matters. You just need to know how to ask some leading questions and get them talking about what they're interested in.
Yeah, that's totally right. I finally, what I decided that got me over my hesitation of there's no way I can do this is, right, if I can find interesting people and get them to tell their story, that's my job. Like that would actually be the job of the host. It's not to actually be the expert, like you said. It's to facilitate the conversations, which I decided, okay, I can do that. Let's give this a shot, and it went really well. So that's good.
It's true. One of my wife's relatives, her aunt, is a long-time interviewer. She wrote documentaries and things like that for PBS, and she told me that one of the things that, really was like pervaded her career with that, is that the trick is to find the sweet spot, find what people are really interested in and animated about and excited about, and then all you have to do is set them running, and they will sort of like take the ball and run with it, and you can just sort of be a facilitator. And I think that's really true.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the trick is to try to bring out the human side of the story behind it, right? If you're talking about some API, it's not just about the API. It's about the amazing things people are doing with it or whatever, right?
Yeah, I definitely agree. And that's actually been a lot of the feedback that I've heard, is that people find most useful is understanding the why behind the creation of a particular library or tool more than how to actually use the tool, because they can go online and look at the documentation for that. So what they're turning to the podcast for is the backstory and the trials and tribulations that plagued the creation of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I see our job, our role basically as storytellers, or people who bring the stories out. Yeah.
So did you know when you first started out on the road to creating Talk Python to Me that it would end up turning into a full-time endeavor?
Oh man, no way. Like I said, I was basically hoping that people would not make fun of me too much, more or less. And that a couple people would show up and listen and appreciate it, right? And I just wanted to have some interesting conversations with people, and I thought, I'll have to be the change I want to see in the world, right? Not knowing you guys were coming, of course, 3 days later. But at the time, right, there was nothing as far as I could see, right? So I'm like, all right, well, I'll do this. But I never even expected to have people sponsor the show. I figured, a couple thousand people come listen to it and it'll probably be great. And that would have been totally fine for me. But it's really gone much better than I expected on several levels. And so, sometimes it's about seizing the opportunity when it's available rather than planning it ahead,
I think it's a testament to how real the need was, how big the empty hole was that we both filled, that we've both been able to have, podcasts, and we're both succeeding at it. We've got, done some really great content. We both have a nice listener base, and it's not like we're stepping on each other's toes. And it's been really interesting to see how the community totally embraced both of us. He's going from 0 to 2. You would think one would, crowd the other out or something, but that absolutely hasn't happened. There's a lot of stories to tell and a lot of interesting people to talk to, and a lot of people who want to hear those stories. So I guess we're both lucky we picked a good niche.
Yeah, I certainly feel lucky, and I believe I try to see the world, and I think that most of the time I do see the world through sort of a lens of abundance, right? Like there's plenty for everybody, and the better we can all be, the better we all will be, rather than, competitive, right? Try to cut this person off or whatever, right? Like that's just the way I see the world and the way people I collaborate with and in business and everything.
So let's continue the conversation a bit more. We've already talked about how you got started with the podcast and how we both started within the same time frame. So what's it like to run a successful podcast? How has it changed your relationship with the community? And what are your favorite parts about actually hosting a podcast?
It's really thrilling, and it's really an honor. Like I kind of hinted at, like I don't feel when I began that I deserved the amount of attention and respect that I got from doing it. I really appreciate it and so on, and it's nice, but I didn't expect that the community would appreciate it so much, I guess. So I really like that part of it, that people seem genuinely happy that what I'm doing is there. Same for your show, right? That what we are all doing is there. And I'm sure you guys have a similar feeling that running the podcast, you get to talk to and interact with people on a weekly basis that are, idols of the community, that do amazing things, that are super smart, and just the ability to, or the opportunity to spend some time talking to all the people who are the guests is really amazing. And I think because of the podcast, it's much easier than it would otherwise be.
Yeah, it's definitely sometimes daunting when you fire up your email client to send an email to somebody to say, hey, I happen to run a podcast. You want to come talk to me about this thing? Because, why would they want to talk to me? They're wildly successful in Python. They've got a package that's been downloaded, umpteen thousand times, but pretty much everybody has been very welcoming and humble and just grateful to be the guest on a podcast.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sometimes people are very busy, but they're always very polite. And that's one of the great things about Python and its communities. As a whole, the community kind of has a no jerks policy.
Yeah, which is really good. And I think one of the lessons that I learned from that is kind of all you got to do is ask. A lot of times, if you just talk to somebody, reach out to somebody, or ask for some kind of opportunity, the chances are that it's probably there. It's just people are too bashful, or they don't want to impose or whatever, so that they don't make the connections, right?
What have been your most popular episodes?
Yeah, I guess I'm just about to press publish on number 66. So that's quite a few. We have almost the same number, given that we started within 3 days of each other. So I think there's two ways to look at it. If you look at the download numbers, I pulled them up this morning, and the most popular one by pure download numbers is this one where I interviewed Justin Seitz called Python Cybersecurity and Penetration Testing. Justin's a really awesome guy, and he tells good stories. And basically, he writes software that does penetration testing and helps, he'll be hired by a company to try to break into their systems and give them a report of how he did it, right? So kind of professional hacker, but on the white hat side of things. So that was really cool to get a look inside of the hacking world. The other two most popular ones, one was with Brett Slatkin, Effective Python. That was really good. He has a great book. He's at Google right now, I think. And then with Roy Rappaport from Netflix, about how Netflix is using Python on all their cloud and DevOps stuff.
I'm really shocked that the interview with the gentleman from the LHC was not high up on the list, because I thought that was totally, utterly fascinating. And I was just listening to it and thinking, how did you meet this man? How does one run into a physicist who works at the Super Collider?
Not just, yeah, so that's Kyle Cranryan. Kyle is a fantastically nice guy. He's a full-on genius type of guy, right? So he was on the team that won the Nobel Prize, and some of his work was fundamental in discovering the Higgs boson, right? How do you, that was kind of what I was hinting at earlier, is you can reach out to people and meet them and have these amazing conversations, and they're often, very accessible and even thankful for the opportunity when you're thinking, why did you even answer me, right? So in terms of my favorites, I would certainly put the Large Hadron Collider episode as right near the top, because wow, what they're doing is just out of this world.
Yeah, that's also, as a host of a podcast, it's kind of difficult to pick favorites. One, because there are so many good topics, and two, because you don't want to have one of your past guests listen and say, hey,
what about mine?
So...
Yeah, no, it is really hard to pick. And I think it's worth emphasizing, almost every episode I've recorded, I'm really, really glad that I did, and it went really well. And just to be honest, I won't name out any episodes, but there's been some, you were asking what it's like to run a successful podcast. It's there's the really cool part where you get to talk to everybody and have this meeting stories and exchanges, and you interact with the community. But there's also it's 11 o'clock at night or 5 a.m, and I really got stuff that I have to finish today, and I'm super tired, but I have this recording, right? And so there's been a few times where I'm I would love to talk to this person, but I'm just life is bearing down on me. And every single time afterwards, I'm wow, that was one of the best shows ever. I can't believe I almost was too tired and tried to reschedule it. This is amazing, right? It's just, and so it's really hard to pick. Even when I think I can't do it because I'm really tired, haven't slept for 2 days, it's still, it's great. So yeah, it's cool.
So in your excellent episode with Keith Heddleston, you talked about how we tend to bash other programming languages. We've done a fair bit of Java bashing here. So that really kind of resonated with me. I was sitting there thinking to myself, wow, I do that. and in my current gig, it's, we use Java a lot, and it's actually the right tool for this particular job, right? We may not particularly enjoy programming in it, but that doesn't lessen its usefulness. And moreover, the people who, contribute these amazing tools and projects, like we really shouldn't be slighting them in their efforts. So how can we help get ourselves and others in our community out of this really bad habit?
It's interesting, and I really enjoyed talking with Kate, and I think I fall victim to this tendency as well. Like I make fun of PHP periodically, and I laugh as I do it because it's still hard not to. But I think I think one of the key things is to realize that every time you look at a library or you look at a programming ecosystem that is not entirely, dead, like APL. Maybe there's nobody left doing APL. I don't know. It's a crazy language. But, Java and other PHP, these are very vibrant communities. And I think the way, personally, it seems like what comes to mind first anyway is realize there are human beings that cared a lot about what they're doing behind all that stuff, right? So you see some, I don't know, let's say data access library in Java, and you're like, God, this is crap, right? This is nothing like SQL Alchemy or whatever. And there's somebody who is solving maybe something amazing, like some amazing problem behind it, right? Maybe Spotify can now do some really cool stuff and people had a great time at a party because of this library, even though like maybe the design patterns are kind of crummy, like somebody made a big difference to someone else. And I guess think of the humans behind it, right? The people.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely key.
Yeah, and also too, a lot of communities and a lot of conferences and companies have a, so-called no jerks policy, and then we turn around and are jerks to people from other communities because they're other than us, and so we think that it's okay, whereas it's in principle not really any different than belittling a member of any type of community. And there's also a fair bit of dogmatism in software where people get stuck on the way that they do things and think of it as being the right way, so anybody who doesn't do it that way just doesn't know what they're doing. And we need to realize that we all work in software, it's a huge space, and sometimes your tool isn't the right tool for the job, or it's not the right tool for somebody else who's doing that job. So we all just need to take a step back for a minute and realize that, and just try to be more inclusive in every sense of the word.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think we do it in software because we feel like it's a meritocracy-based criticism rather than, some other less valuable or less, less good reason to make fun of a person or to make fun of a thing. But it's like I'm attacking the idea of Java,
right,
not the people behind Java or something like this, right? And it doesn't feel like you're hurting people. But at the same time, it's probably not creating a super great environment.
Yeah, and it's also easy to forget how much of people's identities get wrapped up in the code that they produce and the tools that they use.
Yeah,
that is absolutely true.
Deeply,
absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's more common in software development than in many places. Like, if I was a car mechanic and somebody made fun of the brand of wrenches, these Craftsman wrenches, they suck. Like, you probably wouldn't care that much, But if somebody makes fun of your programming language or your database or something, it somehow becomes personal.
And one way that I personally have been able to try to be, or in some cases succeed at being a little more open-minded, is when I go to bash something, I think about like some of the cool things that have come out of that, right? Like PHP is an example. I mean, Facebook is doing some really cool things with PHP. And open sourcing a lot of them and making a lot of people's day-to-day work lives tremendously better because of their contributions to the community. And so, I don't particularly enjoy PHP's syntax, but that doesn't mean that it's not a fundamentally useful tool. And like Tobias, you said you were looking at WordPress plugins earlier, because the fact of the matter is WordPress powers a really big chunk of the internet because it is this amazing workhorse that just does a lot of things right. And a lot of people like to bash on even WordPress, going one level up from programming languages because of its various security flaws that it's had in its history. And yet, if you look at the total number of blogs and general sites for special purposes or churches or whatever the case may be, a huge chunk of them are run on WordPress because from a user experience standpoint, it drives like a Cadillac. It's just so easy and it gets the job done. So maybe we all just need to sort of like, when we go to bash something, think about like, well, what have people made with it that is really neat that we can appreciate, even if we don't particularly like the syntax or the ecosystem or whatever around it.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think the WordPress angle really resonates with me. I have my blog on WordPress and, I don't really care what technology's under it. It does amazing stuff for me, right? And problem solved. So yeah, that's a good point.
So going back to the topic of guests and topics for the shows, how do you actually select the guests and the topics for your show, and how do you organize and plan for the different shows?
Well, first of all, I have to say thanks to you for recommended to me that I use Trello to manage this, because I was doing some weird form of email plus calendars plus Google Docs plus other things, and that just wasn't doing it. So, like you have a Trello board where I put ideas. The ideas come from various places. The ideas come from me sort of running across some news item or some article. I'm like, oh, that is awesome. I got to find out who's behind this and have them on the show, or, find something like that on Twitter and so on. I subscribe to some of the Python newsletters, at least 3 that are pretty decent. And typically there's a couple of cool things in there that maybe they might go on my list. Listeners recommend shows. Sometimes they have really good recommendations. I think we were talking about the Large Hadron Collider. I believe part of that, at least the connection to Kyle, came from listeners helping out on Twitter, and that was cool. Then also conference talks. You and I were bumping into each other at Pycon, making our ways around the booths to talk to the various people. Going, hey, you know what? This looked really cool. Maybe you should come on the show. So those are basically the ways, I guess.
And how do you come up with a list of questions for each episode? How much time do you spend researching and preparing?
Some things are easier than others to talk about because I've got a lot of experience with it. And some I have almost no experience. And so, it requires a decent amount of research. I'd say maybe on average, I spend probably 5 hours of research per episode on looking into things, trying to come up with questions and so on. Sometimes it's a little bit less. Sometimes it's a little bit more. Like if it's a book, maybe I'll read the book. That takes a little longer. But I always try to come up with more like areas of conversation than actual questions, so that it can try to stay as a conversation, right? So I don't want to make it too structured so they feel like they're answering the questions directly. I might write down like the little intro script or something that I do, but the actual interview is I try to make it something that is enough that I won't feel like well, now what do I ask you? I want it to be like a productive, don't waste listener time, not just chit chat conversation. But at the same time, I want to kind of keep it fluid,
First, we made the mistake of using an actual script for the first 1 or 2 episodes. And it is so comical now when I go back and listen to it, because it's like, hey, Tobias, what do you think? I mean, it's just like, we sound so incredibly wooden. It's you just have to appreciate it as comedy and move on, I guess. So
There's a special kind of curse of making podcasters listen to their first few episodes. And this is part of it, right? Like, and the audio and just so many things. Like, I felt like I did an okay job. And like I said, like the response to both of our shows was really good. And so it felt really good. But if I go back and listen, I'm like, oh, can I delete this?
Yeah, there's definitely a big learning curve, because even with the number of resources that are out there, this is how you get started with a podcast, there's no substitute for actually doing it and making those mistakes and realizing, that's why.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
We're getting there.
Yeah, it's definitely a fine balancing act, too, between having the list of questions and subjects that you want to talk about and not just following it and trying to weave those into the conversation. And I think we're getting to the point where we do a pretty good job of that, but there are definitely some times where I find myself just falling back to the list of questions and saying next. And
sure.
Which can sometimes stifle conversation and can interrupt the flow of what we're talking about.
Yeah, it's challenging, and the farther you stray from the thing that you're really knowledgeable about, the harder it is to like keep it flowing. So I think the 2 things that I try to do really hard is stay curious and listen, because it's so easy to try to think about what you're going to ask next while the people are talking. But if you can stay in the conversation, then it's much easier. It's like hanging out at a bar with a beer rather than, orchestrating a recorded conversation.
Yeah. And I've also found, too, that the episodes where we have multiple guests really makes it easier to keep the flow going, because even if the guests don't necessarily know each other directly, they're at least in the same general space. So for instance, when we did our episode about functional programming in Python, the two guests that we had didn't know each other directly, but because they're both interested in functional programming, they were able to play off of each other really well, which helps keep everything flowing and moving and introduces new dimensions that I wouldn't necessarily be able to introduce on my own because I don't have enough expertise.
Yeah, that's really awesome. And you guys have two hosts, which is also really nice. I'm jealous of this.
Yeah, I have to say it is nice, and I really appreciate the way it works. Tobias and I can definitely play off of each other, and I think of good questions or whatever based on the questions that he's asking, and I do definitely think it helps a lot. So yeah, I'm not going to say I wouldn't want to do this on my own, but I think I would enjoy it an awful lot less, and I think it would be less good if I were doing it on my own.
Yeah, I've struggled with this on my show as well, like just because I am doing it on my own, and it would be really nice to have on a whole bunch of areas someone to do it with me. But at the same time, I feel like the scheduling, the time is already super hard with me and the guest, and like having a third it's just it just adds a layer of friction to make it even harder to go forward. So I don't know. Right now I'm doing it solo, but I certainly see the benefits.
It is very hard. There's no question about it. I've taken on a new job recently, and I had to miss a couple of episodes, both when I was signing on and we recently had a GA. My project went live, and I've missed a few episodes because of the fact that it just became totally impossible. It was like, one episode was on the night that we went GA, and I only learned that the GA date was happening like a week before it happened. So, it definitely does make things more difficult. But it's certainly been worth it for us.
Yeah, that's great.
And just to dereference that a bit, GA stands for general availability, in case anyone doesn't know.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that, because I had a couple of other people say, "Oh, what is GA?" And I guess I just always. I have known that particular acronym because I've seen it used in the industry, but I guess it's either fallen out of common use or whatever, because I've had several people say, "What is this GA thing of which you speak?" So thank you, Tobias.
No problem. And going back to our conversation earlier about being inclusive, even little things like that can make a big difference, particularly to people who are new in the industry who don't necessarily have the same background, just explaining acronyms and references where necessary, because it can just make people understand more about what's being talked about and just really appreciate the fact that you actually took the time to point out that, in case you didn't know, this is this thing, because it shows that you care about other people's experience and not just trying to further your own agenda.
Yeah, that's a really good point. What I was surprised about, and I'm sure you guys have a similar experience, is the number of people who are really new to Python or programming who listen to the show. So yeah, I mean, I figured the people who are going to listen to this show are the ones that are like really into it, and they've been using these libraries, and they want to hear like the person who wrote the library tell them all about it or whatever. And there's of course a bunch of people like this, and that's great. But there's a surprising number of people that will write me and say, "Hey, I'm brand new at programming," or "I'm trying to get my first job," or something like this. "Do you have some advice?" And like, wow, and you listen to my show? Okay, awesome. But it's great to help them. And things like that, Tobias, are I think appreciated, especially by that group.
I think that speaks to the point of podcasts serve a couple of functions, right? Like they serve as vehicles for learning for, as you say, sort of like the people at various levels of expertise, but also as I'm kind of interested in Python and I kind of might want to dip my toe into the waters. Let's see what's out there. And you subscribe to the podcast, right? And you hear about like some of the cool things that are being built with Python because of the guests that we have. And I mean, I even do that. I listen to JavaScript Jabber as a for instance, and I've never actually written a line of JavaScript. I do mostly back-end and systems engineering kind of stuff, but I really like the show and I find it fascinating just to sort of listen to, what's up and coming, what's interesting, what's going on in that community, because I learn things even if I don't use Java per se, that I can apply to my own day-to-day life, or, I've been able to refer people to a couple of tools or whatever as a result of the things that I've heard. So I think you guys are both right, and that we need to sort of be aware that it's not just hardcore, Pythonistas who are listening. It's people who are interested and want to learn more.
Yeah, the challenge is striking a balance where both groups are engaged. And you don't leave them out, right? But I think that's why the stories are important, because everybody loves stories.
And that's also, too, why I generally like to start the conversation with, what is this thing that we're talking about? And can you explain a little bit of its background so that everybody has a common starting point for the conversation rather than just assuming going into it that, oh, this is this wildly popular tool, everybody must know it.
Yeah, absolutely.
What is the most significant thing that you've learned from the podcasting experience?
Well, I think I sort of touched on that before. That there's a lot of opportunity out there, and people are really open and willing to share way more than you probably realize with you. But you have to have the courage or the motivation to go ask, right? So I think that's probably the biggest thing I learned is that there's so many people I've reached out to, and they're not just like, well, yeah, I guess I could spare 30 minutes, whatever. But they're like, wow, that's amazing. I would love to do it. And they're as excited to be on the show as I am excited to reach out to them. And, before doing the podcast, I didn't see the world that way.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And it becomes very evident that because all these people who are creating these tools or working on their particular initiatives, they want the opportunity to talk about the thing that they're passionate about. And so that's why they're willing and interested in coming on to a podcast, because it's a great forum to spread that message and spread their knowledge and get other people interested in the things that they are interested in.
Yep, absolutely.
And what do you wish you did differently, and how are you looking to improve?
So I'm a little hesitant to wish for something different because I might get it, right? Like I don't see too many major things that I think I would change. Like we were talking, I obviously wish I did a better job on my first set of shows because there were really great people there and I could showcase them better, I think, if I just had more experience about, like, what are you gonna do? You're starting out, right? But I guess I really need to do a better job of like scheduling and planning. I've been traveling the last 5 weeks out of 8 and trying to continue recording and releasing on a regular basis while doing that is challenging. Conferences and training and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the more difficult parts is maintaining a full schedule. I have been doing that in fits and starts, and sometimes I get to the point of, oh, I don't have anything scheduled for next week, and then there's a flurry, and then somehow you end up with 2 or 3 interviews the following week, and oh, how did that happen?
Yeah, that's great.
So, as we've mentioned a couple of times, both you and I were at Pycon this year, and we got the chance to hang out a bit. What was your impression of the conference, and what do you think are some of the major trends that you saw?
Well, I think, first of all, the conference was really, really amazing. Like, if people are out there listening and thinking, should I go to Pycon? Yes, you should go to Pycon. It's really an interesting experience, and the community is super welcoming, and just being there and feeling the vibe makes it even nicer.
I'll also interject and say that if you can't make it to PyCon, then there are lots and lots of regional conferences and also special interest conferences about Python that you should check out in case PyCon is either too far or too expensive for you.
Right. PyOhio, PyTexas, and there's a bunch in Europe. All over, yeah. There's probably something regional not too far from you. And then you put together an open session on Python podcasts that we did together, and that was really great to meet a bunch of people. I think we probably met about 25 listeners, and we just had a really nice conversation with them about what they like about us doing the podcast, what they'd like to see more of, less of. That was really cool. So thanks for putting that together.
Sure. Yeah, that was a great experience getting to actually be face-to-face with the audience, because you might interact with them a little bit on Twitter or via email, but you lose context in those forums, and being able to actually have a true dialogue, you get a lot more out of it, and their appreciation is more visceral in that context.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that was one of the best things about the whole conference, was to meet people who listened to the show, or guests who had been on the show, or guests who are going to be on the show, like just this whole human face-to-face component, because even though the conversations are very real and natural, it's not the same as hanging out for an hour with someone.
Absolutely. And what were your favorite sessions from the conference, and do you have any shows scheduled to follow up on them?
Yes, somewhat. I do. And my favorite, there were some really, really good ones. Now, just to be clear, I didn't go to that many sessions. I took the hallway track to really, I spent most of my time meeting with people and talking to people and just, hey, let's take this next hour and go talk about this thing. And that was super amazing. So in some sense, that was my favorite part. I really loved the keynote. The closing keynote. Who was that by? That was K. Lars John. Kalar's Lawn. And he did an amazing job of sort of telling this human story around programming and complexity and stuff. So I really like that one. And then Jesse Davis from MongoDB, he was one of the early guests who I wish I had done a better job recording and telling the story, but he's a great guy. And he did one on writing an excellent programming blog. So really great how-to tips session on if you're going to write a blog for programmers as a techie, this is what you should do. You're not this type of blog. You're not that type of news channel. These are the things that matters. These are the sort of design patterns of blogging almost. It was really cool. And then the last one was Brett Slatkin's Refactoring Python, Why and How to Restructure Your Code. Those are my three I'll put out there.
Yeah, there were definitely a lot of great sessions, and I'll echo yours choice of the closing keynote. It was pretty amazing, and at the end of it, I was just sitting there floored, and I think everybody in the audience was too, because it was just so beautifully put together, and there was a very good mixed media presentation of... I'm not going to spoil it for anybody who hasn't seen it, just go to YouTube and watch it. One of the sessions that I did follow up on recently, and actually just released the episode for, was Russell Keith McGee from the Beware suite of tools. I thought his talk about running Python on mobile platforms was really well done, and I really appreciated being able to follow up and go deeper on the backstory and the internals of all of his work with that.
Yeah, that's cool. That's really great. Yeah, I got some sessions lined up from the conference as well.
And changing gears a bit, the sites that you run your podcast and trainings on say at the bottom that they were 100% handcrafted. And I'm wondering if you can give us a look inside of what the moving parts are in there.
Sure. So I did consider WordPress. That was certainly one of the things I was looking at. For the most part, I spend my time writing web apps. And so creating another web app was not like a huge challenge. So I kind of felt like if I go down the WordPress route or something pre-baked, I'll have to fit into whatever mold they give me. And I kind of felt like I was going to give it a really good effort to make this podcast something cool. And I wanted to have something I could build on and change like I wanted. So I basically built the website for talkpython.fm from scratch, and then the training one as a separate one from scratch. And these are all Python 3 written in Pyramid using SQL Alchemy, and like all the front end design stuff is Bootstrap, more or less. So, and then the training side is like all that, but then it has, of course, all the e-commerce stuff you need. So like it uses Stripe checkout, and it has a bunch of mail it sends. So it uses Amazon, a simple email service, MailChimp, some cool libraries I'll talk about in my picks, things like that.
Yeah, it's definitely difficult being able to balance the sort of not invented here syndrome of, oh, I want to build this all in Python because it's a Python podcast, versus going with the off-the-shelf solution that fits almost everything that you need because it is easy to get up and running. I'm battling with that myself right now. So right now we use a static site for the podcast, but there are a number of different things that I would like to be able to do that require a bit more dynamicism. So I'm currently in the process of deciding, do I just go with a WordPress site and use some of the plugins because it's there and easy to use? Or do I succumb to my not invented here syndrome and go and build some custom platform that uses Python for everything and will require me to do some rework of things that might already exist? So it's a difficult trade-off, because as a technologist, I want to be able to say, oh, I built this entire thing from the ground up, but I have a lot of time constraints, so I don't know if I'm going to be able to dedicate that much effort to it. So
Yeah. I try to temper my not invented here syndrome with, you now have another thing to babysit syndrome. You now have another server to babysit. You now have another thing that will break that you have to fix. Like, yeah. So I that like limits my desire, but to sort of make something from scratch. So for example, my blog is just on WordPress.com. And forget it, right? It just runs. But I don't know, somehow I sort of just tipped the balance of the scales to the other side and went and created the website.
The good news, too, is that, when you were describing what these handcrafted sites use as far as pieces, a lot of it seems like in today's sort of commoditized economy, you can put the effort into what makes your site great, right? Like you don't have to think about payment processing because Stripe handles it for you. You don't have to think about email sending because, AWS, SMS handles it for you. So it's like, I feel like it's a great time to be a developer in that regard, and that so much is sort of componentized and handled for you. So you can just sort of, not that it doesn't take work to make all those things, glue together in a harmonious way. It does. But it's not like years ago where you're sitting there having to worry about designing the forms around your e-commerce pipeline in such a way that somebody can't cram random bytes into the appropriate fields and steal your stuff or something like that, or worse, compromise your site, get root, and then scribble hate mail all over it or something.
Right. Or even, speaking of AWS, buying, you no longer have to buy machines, load balancers, all just like, you don't need a data center, or you don't need a connection. Like, all of those things go away. These are all checkboxes on websites and put it together. I think the real challenge around building your own thing versus going to something like WordPress or something else is actually, for many people, the web design component of it more than it is database query form on a page and data, dynamic page. It's, well, I could put that up there, but it's going to look like crap. And then how, maybe I'll just go with WordPress because I can grab this theme that already looks great. I think that's also part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That the professional ecosystem around WordPress is part of what makes it so compelling, is because people like real honest to God pro web designers who build really great sites for big names that everyone would know have spent their time and effort putting together these themes. And yes, you have to pay for them, but it's worth it because they look awesome.
Yep, absolutely.
And in recent news, you stirred things up with Stitcher just the other day. So can you explain a bit what's up with that?
Yeah, I kind of sent you guys a message, some of the other Python podcast folks as well. So I recently decided to, let me say what Stitcher is, because probably people don't, not everyone knows. So Stitcher is like a podcast player. Right, you can go to the App Store or Google Play Store and download Stitcher, and you can find your podcasts and other shows and subscribe to them. And it's supposed to be mobile friendly, so it will like always be on their app. They download a smaller version because they take your MP3s and they re-encode them into a low bit rate, so they're small on your device, and download those, and then you can play them. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. Like, if people know, okay, well they're cutting down the quality of my show, but that's what people are used to on this player, then, that's kind of what they chose, right? But Stitcher recently got bought by a company called Midroll and Scripps. It's kind of a collaborative thing. And they're all about advertising and monetizing podcasts. And, Stitcher takes your show, yours and mine. I don't know which ones they choose to do it to, but in podcasts in general, they take the shows from the producers like us. They take them, they break them apart. They put their own ads into the show, their own audio ads in the show, and then they don't sell them. They put them out to the people who listen via Stitcher, and you and I don't even get notified about it or paid a single penny for it. All right, and to me, this doesn't seem really great, but they've got this huge sort of media conglomerate behind it. And if what the support for podcasts looks like in the future is kind of like AdWords is to blogs, if that's kind of how Stitcher is to podcasters, what AdWords is to blogs, then it's going to like seriously wipe out a lot of good stuff, right? Because instead of doing something more full-time or dedicating more energy, we'll have to all do more consulting or more work, or we'll just stop. And so I deleted my show from Stitcher and wrote a big blog post that caused a lot of stir, I guess. Sorry, go ahead.
And I just want to say also that even as a podcast listener, when I listen to, like, say your show is for instance, and you do the sponsors, even in the middle of the show, beginning of the show, or whatever, I think to myself, as much as I find, like, personally sponsorships in the middle of a show kind of disturbs the flow a little bit. But I think to myself, that's how he's making his living, right? Like, this is money that he needs to put bread on the table, and the price of getting this awesome free content is that I have to listen to that sponsorship. But when Stitcher does that, it completely throws that equation, on its ear, and now it's not helping to pay your expenses. It's I guess, I don't even know, going into the coffers of this giant company. So I agree. I think that's definitely really a disturbing trend. But now, so this gets back to what licensing do we use, right? Like, I think ours is in Creative Commons. So by rights, they can really do whatever they want with it, including chop it up and, make mincemeat out of it and put ads in the middle. So what license do you use?
And it's clear. It's clear, and it's in the terms of service. When you actively put your show on Stitcher, they say, yeah, we're going to do this. And you're like, okay, right. And I agreed to that, right? Because a bunch of listeners wanted it there. And I thought, well, it's more important for them to get the content than it is to worry about them making a change and send it out to a small portion of my listeners. But I kind of decided this week, all right, no, I'd like to make a stand against this. This doesn't seem right, regardless of how many people do or don't listen through Stitcher on my show. For the license, I just use it's just copyright. I don't have a sharing component to it. I do have my transcripts on GitHub under, I think, MIT or Creative Commons. I can't remember which, but the actual audio is just copyright.
Well, that makes sense, actually. And as a copyright holder, you probably have more control.
So, as a podcast host and somebody who is a fan of podcasts, what do you listen to when you're not producing your own show?
Sure. So I listen to your show. I like the guests you have. You guys have a great show. I also listen to Partially Derivative. Do you know this one?
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
I listen to that one as well. They're an interesting show. They have a lot of good topics.
They do. I listen to them when I need something light and silly because they're pretty light and silly. But Jonathan, Chris, and Vidya do a good job. It's like a data science, usually has a Python twist to it. That's cool. I listen to Brian Ocken's Test and Code podcast. Then also, like on the business side, I listen to a really cool podcast called Exponent at exponent.fm. And then Mixergy is the really cool one for like stories of people doing startups. And then the startup podcast by Gimlet, because that whole sort of idea behind Gimlet is really, people don't know, it is really quite amazing. I also listen to Developer on Fire and Away from the Keyboard. Those are both good. But the Gimlet stuff, they started around the same time we did, maybe 6 months before. Maybe. Yeah, I think something like that. Not long. And these are guys from NPR who left NPR to create some podcasts and sort of storytelling through the podcast medium. And they document their creating the company, leaving their jobs, trying to start it, and basically their first episode, their first season, which is really good. The others are sort of not as good, but the first season is really good. They document their creation of the company and how they are like concerned about Edie. Like we're not really making much money anymore. This is really scary. And by the end of I think season 2, it's probably a bit of a spoiler, but they got like $6 million in venture capital, and their podcast company is valued at $25 million. Think of that.
Yeah. Yeah, podcasting is definitely a burgeoning space right now, and there's a lot of potential revenue to be generated, but it's still very much early days, and trying to figure out what that revenue model looks like is going to take some time. So that's where the whole Stitcher and mid-roll thing comes into play a bit too, is they're trying to figure out one play for generating revenue, at least for some people in the podcast space, not necessarily for the creators, but it's going to take some time to figure out how it shakes out.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting time. I just want to comment on that really quick. Like when I first started getting sponsors on my show, a couple of people wrote me and said, look, I'm kind of concerned that having these sponsors on your show is going to change the nature of your show and we're not going to like it anymore. And then after a few weeks, I think even the people that wrote me sort of realized like, oh, wait, this means this show is going to be around for a long time. It's not going to like vanish. And I think, 30 seconds here and 30 seconds there is not a huge price to pay to have like this as an ongoing part of the community. And I feel like that probably between both of our shows, people have sort of, they probably always knew that, but I kind of feel like I don't hear any of those things like, oh, why do you have sponsors? This seems crummy. Like they all seem to appreciate that the sponsors are supporting the show. They check out their products and I try to make it fit. As you guys do too.
Yeah, and two, having the sponsor gives you, as a host, a certain amount of accountability of, you might want to slack off and say, I'm not going to put anything out this week, which is the first step down a slippery slope of I'm just never going to put out anything else. And so having that sponsorship holds you accountable, says, I have to put something out this week because somebody has already compensated me for this time that I'm spending. So it's not a question of do I want to, it's a question of have to, which helps motivate, and it's not in any way a bad thing. It's just that, having that accountability means that we are both more likely to continue this endeavor far into the future.
Yeah, I think it's a super positive thing. I was thinking about why some of the other podcasts didn't stick around. And I think, it's so easy for you to hit a patch of like super intense work or something crazy with a family or a lot of travel, and you just kind of stop and then, you just don't quite get back to it. So I think it's a really important component to keeping this going long term.
And the fact of the matter is, hosting a podcast costs money. Not huge money, not deal-breaking money, but money. And the fact that we can have some of those expenses paid, and also in our case, we were able to pay for things like editing and things like that because we both work very full-time jobs, and so it's really nice to be able to have the ability to have the expenses paid and also have some of the ancillary time that's not about making and actually hosting the podcast saved, that would otherwise make this very burdensome and kind of really not necessarily tenable for us, handled.
Yeah, absolutely. And it also, a more personal level, it kind of helps, like, you justify the time, say to your family, like, if I'm talking to my wife, I'm like, look, I'm going to go do this thing instead of, watching TV together or whatever, but it's, it has this value back to us, right? Instead of like, you're spending too much time on your hobby.
Yeah, definitely. I can second that sentiment. Before we wrap up, is there anything that we didn't cover that you would like to, or any other questions that you think we should have asked?
I feel like we've covered a lot. I don't think there's really any questions we need to cover, but I want to express my gratitude to, like, the whole community for listening to our podcasts, and it's a super rewarding experience, and I'm glad every week I get to share it with people and hear back from them.
Yeah, I'll second that sentiment as well.
It's definitely been something that's paid back way more than I've given to it.
So for anybody who wants to follow you and keep in touch with what you're doing, what would be the best ways for them to do that?
Social media-wise, probably the best way to get in touch with me is on Twitter. I'm at mkennedy, so check me out there. The website's podcast is at talkpython.fm. My personal blog is at michaelckennedy.net. All the Irish politicians stole the shorter version. And I'm also on GitHub at github.com/MikeCKennedy.
So with that, I'll move us into the picks. My first pick today is the Batman vs. Superman Dawn of Justice movie. I just watched that recently, and going into it, I, like a number of other people, thought to myself, Ben Affleck is Batman? What is going on with the world? But it was actually really well done, and he played the role superbly well. So I absolutely recommend going to see that movie if you haven't already. They did a very good job of dealing with some interesting topics of, what it means to have power, who can hold people in power accountable, what is the responsibility of those people who have that power to the general populace. Just a lot of good themes, good presentation, very good acting. Absolutely recommend watching it. On a slightly different tack, I recently watched the Lego Brickumentary with my son recently, and another movie where they did a really good job, but in a very different way. So it's a documentary about the company Lego and the community that has grown up around the Lego toys. And my son is a very big fan of Lego himself. He likes a lot of the sets that they put out, and the documentary does a really good job of appealing to both younger people as well as older people, because there are a lot of scenes that tie the overall theme together where it's stop motion animation of a Lego character, and there are a lot of very interesting things that people are doing with Lego that you wouldn't think of at first. And I'm going to leave it at that so that you go and watch the documentary yourself.
Nice. Yeah, I saw they had Legos on the Juno spaceship that was orbiting Jupiter now, like a
Yes.
Lego spaceman. Yeah, that's awesome.
They actually talk about that in the documentary. They're actually custom die-cast aluminum Lego minifigures of, I'm going to forget the people that they did it of, but it was people from various legends. So
Sweet.
yeah, it was very cool. And my last pick is going to be the console tool from HashiCorp. It's a service discovery layer for your cloud or data center, and they did a really good job of making it easy to get up and running and very powerful to use. And I think one of the really innovative and useful things that they did with it is they exposed a DNS interface so that you can do service discovery by just changing the DNS address that you're referencing in your dependent application, so that you don't have to introduce a heavy dependency of, now you need to have this API client that calls out to this API to request this information and put it back in. You can just swap out your DNS string and it just does its magic. So I recently got that deployed at my work, and we're using it now, and it's been pretty great. And with that, I'll pass it to you.
Thanks.
Chris.
I want to second HashiCorp Console. It's a really cool tool. It's also a key value store, and it integrates in really interesting ways with some of HashiCorp's other products like Terraform and other things. So I have yet to use it at work, but I definitely, it's something I've got my eye on, I've been playing with and really, really like. So for my first pick, I'm going to go with an application. I think it's currently iOS only, but hopefully it'll go cross-platform soon. I'm a huge fan of sort of entertainment that breaks the mold. And this is a good example of that. It's called Yarn. And it's essentially everyone, there are lots of things that people compare to choose your own adventure books. But this is really like the choose your own adventure books in the sense that the stories that this thing enables, you are effectively reading the story, which can also have illustrations and sounds and things, and you choose what responses the characters may give in the story, and the story unfolds in different ways as a result of your responses. And I encountered this thing. It just came out very recently, and I think it's awfully cool. I hope more people use it and more people write stories for it, because I think it's a really great example of using technology to sort of tell stories and kind of bring that into the next level and into a space that's traditional books just either can't or are very, very clumsy at representing.
Oh, that's awesome.
My next pick is the Apple Magic Mouse 2. I have not had a lot of good things to say about Apple Peripherals lately because honestly there are a lot of them that I've found really kind of lackluster. I always liked the original Magic Mouse. I'm using one right now, in fact, but the fact that it relies on AA batteries is just the most infuriating thing ever, because you're sitting there at the most critical time and your mouse suddenly says, like, low power, battery dying, and then you have to, especially if you're in a workplace environment, you have to go on the quest for who might be the keeper of the AA batteries that month, or whatever the case may be. So it's a very frustrating design characteristic. But with the Magic Mouse 2, they've done away with that, and the mouse, and they also have a keyboard that works the same way, has a lithium-ion battery permanently baked into it. And so you simply plug the mouse into any lightning cable that you will likely have attached to your computer and recharge it. And then the recharge cycle is super, super fast. 2 minutes of recharge gives you 9 hours of working time. So really, it's the kind of thing that, you see your mouse getting low, you're going to lunch or whatever the case may be, and you plug it in, or even in a pinch, you plug it in while you go get, a glass of water or something, and you're good to go. So I really like the mouse. I've always appreciated the ergonomics of this device, and now they've taken care of the one sort of gigantic wart that made me not like it as much. So for my final pick, it's a podcast. It's a particular episode of 99% Invisible, which is an awesome podcast that I've picked before and just can't gush about enough. This is a documentary from 1989, or I believe 1980s anyway, that they actually put together and rebroadcasted, called Remembering Stonewall. And for people like me, and I'm guessing many of our listeners who were born sort of in the wake of Stonewall and all the societal changes that occurred sort of as a result, if not directly of that, then the ripples from that certainly were felt by everyone in American society. This is not just your standard sort of like, this is what happened, this is blah blah telling the story. It's interviews with all sides, right? They're interviewing people who were the rioters. They're interviewing people who were the police, who were initially sent in to basically break up and bust the people who were in the nightclub. And it's, interviews with journalists and bystanders who sort of witnessed the whole thing. And I found it really incredibly compelling, and it should be required listening, because I think that, especially being a white heterosexual man, I think it's really important to remember that civil rights aren't just about one particular minority, right? It's about all of us, and it's important. The way we treat the people who we're marginalizing in our society says a lot about the society. So I think things like this are extremely important, no matter what you think about gay rights. And that's it for me for picks. Michael, what do you have for us?
All right, I got a couple of Python ones here. So first of all, my first pick is PyPI.io. So we all know about PyPI, and it's a super old technology. Did you guys have Donald Stuft on your show?
We did. It was awesome.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, he's really great. And I just had him on last week, I guess, week before last. And this is the new version of the Python package index. This is the new website, and it's even though it's in a pre-release, not quite finished, it's much nicer to work with, and it points at the same underlying data store as the other older version, the legacy PyPI at some point we'll call it, right? And so you can use this to sort of explore packages from a web perspective and still get the same data. So that's cool. The other one is something on PyPI, which is passlib. So if you have to deal with putting users and passwords into databases, you have to either recklessly put the password straight in the database, or you have to hash them somehow, right? But hashing them is increasingly challenging as you can go to AWS and get a GPU cluster and then, break an insane amount of passwords, even if they're hashed that way. So you got to you got to fold them and add custom salt and all sorts of stuff. It gets really challenging. So passlib is a Python library that you can just basically go in there and say, I want to use like bcrypt and I want to use the default amount of computational time. So it's like 0.2 seconds of folding the password to verify it and things like this. So it's a really great way for like easily adding secure user storage capabilities basically around passwords. And then the last two are Pycon presentations. One is just youtube.com/Pycon 2016. That's all the talks from the conference, which there's a bunch to pick from and they're great. And then my other pick is actually the Kalar's Lawn closing keynote. That was really amazing.
Yeah, I'm going to second year pick of the PyPI.io. That's actually become my default interface to the package index whenever I'm searching for something. And I actually have a shortcut in my browser that allows me to just search it directly without even having to think about how to go about it.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, and I've started using that in my show notes and my links on my blogs and podcasts to like talk about packages. So I think, we can kind of nudge people to start moving there on our shows.
I think that's important, and not just to move there, but at least when we had Donald on here, he talked about how they're actively looking for assistance, right? Like they want to not just get everybody to move there, but they want to finish it and make it the new PyPI. So they can use every bit of assistance they can, and they apparently have some good sort of intro issues. So if you have any time at all and you're thinking of contributing to an open source project, definitely consider looking those guys up, and you will be making a huge contribution to the overall Python community if you do.
Yep, agreed.
Well, we definitely appreciate you taking the time out of your day to come and talk to us and tell us about your podcast and your experience with Python and its community. It's been a lot of fun, and I also enjoyed hanging out with you at PyCon, so it was great to meet in person. I'm sure that we'll circle back at some point as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Chris, Tobias, thank you so much for having me on. This is a great opportunity, and I really enjoyed the conversation. And yes, it was definitely fun at PyCon. And you guys are invited to talk Python to me sometime soon, as soon as we can set up the scheduling. How's that?
Sounds great. Looking forward to it. Thanks. Bye-bye.